Hi, now that we've laid the groundwork for what comprises the corporate life cycle in its different phases, in this session I want to focus on how to measure where your company falls in the life cycle, what determines the shape and the length of a life cycle, and how that plays out with individual companies. So let's think about what it is that you can use to measure where your company falls in the life cycle. Put simply, if I gave you a company and said, is it a young company, a middle-aged company, a declining company, how would you put it? Let's start with the simplest metric. You could look at corporate age. What is corporate age? Look at the time or the year that a company is founded. Let's say it's 1976. Look at the current year, 2024. That would make it 48 years old. You're saying, so what? Put simply, age then becomes a stand-in for where you are in the corporate life cycle. Older companies are more likely to be mature and declining companies. Younger companies are more likely to be growth companies. I know. It's a very broad metric, and you can already think of exceptions. But let's see how this measure plays out if you used it. I started by looking at all publicly traded companies and measuring their corporate age, the time from which they were founded to the current year. This is a distribution of corporate age of publicly traded companies broken down by geography. And you can already see that there are variations across the world. Japan has some of the oldest publicly traded companies in the world. The median age of a Japanese company is much higher than the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is kind of a mix. I mean, it'd be nice if you could say emerging market companies are younger, mature market companies are older. It doesn't seem to work that way. US companies, on the median age of a US company is actually lower than the median age of an Indian company. So clearly there are other factors that determine the aging of companies, but this is a simple metric. Now, as we looked at the corporate life cycle, the two metrics that we focused on as we went through the life cycle were revenue growth, rather than earnings growth, because revenue growth is high at young companies, declines as you mature, and perhaps becomes negative as you decline. And operating margins, again, at the risk of generalizing, young companies tend to have negative margins as they're building their business models. Those margins turn positive and stable at mature companies and then start to decline in declining companies. So if age is a good measure of where you're in the life cycle, then there should be a correlation between age and those metrics, and there is. In this graph, I've looked at revenue growth and operating margin. Operating margin is operating profits, earnings before interest and taxes, as a percent of revenues. And as you look across the age groups, and I've broken down all publicly traded companies listed globally into age deciles, from youngest companies, the bottom decile, to oldest companies, the top decile. If you look at the median revenue growth for the youngest companies is about 18%. The median revenue growth for the oldest companies is about 1.57%. So clearly, as companies age, you can see revenue growth start to decline, at least across the broad sample. And if you look at margins, you see the phenomenon play out. The youngest companies, the median margin is actually negative, minus 3%. And it tends to get more positive, though it starts to level off around 5th, 6th decile. So at least broadly, age is a measure of where a company falls in the life cycle, and it seems to be core with operating metrics. The second measure used to put a company in where it is in the life cycle is look at what sector it's in. I'll give you my favorite example. Every time people talk about tech companies, it's almost a postscript that they think of these companies as growth companies. For better or worse, you attribute growth to a company based on what sector it's in. If it's a utility, you start off with the presumption that's likely to be a mature company, whereas if it's a software company, think of it as a growth company. Let's start by looking at how reasonable is that assumption. And I started by looking at the sector breakdown of US and global firms in July of 2022. The sectors are S&P sectors, and you can see that the breakdown, for global and US you see the listing of the number of companies in each sector. Again, let's focus on operating metrics to see if there's some truth to the notion that technology companies are high growth companies. If you look at the median growth rate for technology companies, it's about 8.47%. That is higher than the median growth for the entire market. But it's not the highest growth rate that you see across sectors. In fact, healthcare globally has a higher revenue growth rate than technology. If you look at margins, again, there's very little link that I can give you between margins and where a company is in the life cycle. So unlike age, which seems to work reasonably well at telling you where a company is in the life cycle, sector doesn't seem to work that well. The operating metric and revenue growth statistics for sectors don't suggest that shortcuts on, like technology companies or growth companies work anymore. We'll talk about why. In fact, since I was looking at sectors, which are kind of broad-based, I broke companies down into 100 different industries. And I looked at the highest growth and the lowest growth industry groups. And again, take it with a grain of salt. You see healthcare as the highest revenue growth in the information. And this is a combination of healthcare and technology, highest median revenue growth rate and negative margins. So perhaps if you want to argue that companies in the healthcare technology space are young growth companies, you have a reasonable basis. If you look at the lowest growth sectors, airlines, hotel and gaming, transportation, and again, there is some basis to arguing that these lowest growth companies are among the declining part of the economy. But that's again something that we're using a bludgeon to make that judgment. So you can look at corporate age, you can look at what sector or industry a company is in, but ultimately, where you're in the life cycle will come from what your operating metrics look like. In this table, I've looked at what your operating metrics should look like at each phase, the 6 phases. If you're a startup, I should expect to see no revenues. And if you have revenues, the growth will be very high because you have tiny revenues growing out. Your margins are likely to be very negative. Your reinvestment is likely to be high because you're going for growth. And your free cash flow, which is what you're left with after you've reinvested, is very negative. And I've tracked revenue growth, margins, reinvestment, and free cash flows across the life cycle. So as you go through the life cycle, revenue growth goes from very high down to negative. As you go through the life cycle, your operating margins start to improve, peak during mature growth and mature stable, and then start to decline. Your reinvestment tends to be highest early in the life cycle, level off when you're middle-aged or a mature company, and perhaps become negative as you divest as a declining company. And your free cash flows, which start off as very negative, eventually turn positive and peak when you're a mature company before declining when you're a declining company. You're saying, how does that help me? When you look at your company's revenue growth, margins, reinvestment, and free cash flows, you should get a sense of where your company falls in the life cycle. If it has very low revenue growth, high margins, not reinvesting much, it's tough to make the argument that it's a growth company. So what I did was I took my publicly traded company database and I broke these companies down into revenue growth deciles and margin deciles. And again, this is my very rough measure of where publicly traded companies in the middle of 2022 fell in the life cycle. At the at the bottom right hand corner, your superstar growth companies. Why superstar? Because they're companies that seem to get the best of both worlds. They have high revenue growth. They're in the 9th or 10th deciles of revenue growth, and also high margins. At the other extreme are your worst possible companies. These are the companies with negative or very low revenue growth. The bottom deciles have revenue growth, and also the bottom deciles of profit margins. Terrible companies and terrible businesses, at least the moment that I looked at them. You have companies in decline. If you go to the left-hand corner, these are companies that are not growing very fast but have very high profit margins. Tobacco companies would be a good example. Declining but highly profitable. If you go to the other extreme, you have companies with high revenue growth and negative margins. These are companies where you might cut them some grace, saying you have high revenue growth, your margins are negative, but perhaps you'll get economies of scale to work for you. And the middle are your mature companies that fall in the middle, both in terms of revenue growth and margins. So you can use age as a kind of a very quick to get a quick sense of where your company falls in the life cycle. You can look at the sector it operates and maybe make a judgment, but your best measure of where a company falls in the life cycle is look at revenue growth and margins and think about what you see there and what that'll mean in terms of where the company is in the life cycle. Now let's talk a little bit about the dimensions of the corporate life cycle. You're saying, what do you mean by dimensions? First, let's talk about the length of a corporate life cycle. Unlike a human life cycle, which is constrained, you don't see 500-year-old men or women walking around. Corporate life cycles can have extended phases. They can last hundreds of years, or they can last only 3 or 5 years. So I want to talk about the length of the life cycle. What allows some companies to live longer than others. Second, I want to talk about the height of the life cycle. How big do you get before you peak out? And again, you're going to see huge variations across companies as to how high the life cycle can get. Third, I want to talk about the steepness of the life cycle. How quickly do you go from being nothing to the peak of your life cycle? We'll again see variations. For some companies, it takes decades to go from being small to large companies. For other companies, they can pull it off in a few years, 6, 7, 10 years. And finally, I want to talk about the top of the life cycle. Once you hit the peak, how long can you stay at the peak? The flatness at the top, because that's where you harvest your cash flows. The longer you can stay at the peak, the more valuable you become as a business. Let's start with the length of the life cycle. What is it that determines how long a company lasts? The first is the type of business you're in. If you're in a business that is where the demand is going to be there for a long time, you should last longer than a company that provides a product or a service that has a much limited life. The longest lived company in history is a privately owned business called Kongo Gumi, a Japanese business. So what did it do? It built Japanese shrines. That's all they did. And that's something you're going to see as a trade-off. Companies that last longer tend to be much less ambitious in what they want to do. Kongo Gumi was founded in, I think, 581 AD, lasted almost 1500 years before it ceased to exist. Just a few years ago. Company, so the type of business you're in matters. The second is how long it takes you to build a business. Companies in business where it takes a lot longer to build a business, by definition, will also last a lot longer if they survive. Because if it takes you 70 years to build a business or 50 years, you're more likely to last longer. The third is, what are the barriers to entry for competitors? If you're in a business where it's very difficult for competition to come in, you will live longer than a company in a business where competition is much more imminent. There's a reason publicly traded utility companies, power companies, water companies tend to be older companies, have been around longer, because for much of their lives they were monopolies. It was difficult for an outsider to come in. The fourth factor is macroeconomic conditions. If you're a publicly traded company in a country where there's a tremendous amount of strife and instability, it's much more difficult to last for a long time than if you're in a country which is mature and with stable economic and tax policies. So where you are in the world can determine how long you can survive as a company. The fifth is what kind of ownership structure you have. Some of the oldest, remember that that some of the oldest companies in the world tend to be privately owned, often family-run companies, where the management gets passed on through the generations. If you're a company that's built around a key person, if that key person passes away, as they eventually will, your company life is going to be constrained by how long that person is around. Whereas if you're a company which has a management that has good succession plans, it can pass on, you should last longer. And finally, it depends on what time horizon you have among the people who run the business. Now, the Kongo Gumi lasted a long time because it was run by people who were not ambitious. They didn't want to make the company bigger, enter new businesses. They were okay being small, successful businesses. It may seem ironic that the companies that overreach, that want to grow faster, might be shortening their lives in the process because they're overreaching. So those things all determine the length of the life cycle. Now, what about the height of the life cycle? How big can you get? The first is it depends on the potential market for your product or service. The larger that potential market, the bigger you can get as a company. In fact, later when we talk about young companies, we'll talk about how total addressable market, TAMs, have become a big component in selling these companies and pushing up their market prices. The second is geographical reach. If you're a company that is isolated to a small part of the world with a small population, you will, by definition, even if you're successful, be a smaller company than a company in India or China because they're much bigger markets. Globalization has allowed companies to become bigger across the globe because you're no longer constrained by just your domestic market. The third is if you can take a business model which is isolated and kind of restricted, and with technology make it accessible to a bigger market. you've raised the height of your life cycle. I mean, if you take car service pre-2008, typical car service company was a taxi cab company. Almost by definition, even the most successful taxi cab company in the world was small because it was localized. A New York City taxi cab company could not go to Tokyo. Uber and Lyft and the other ride-sharing companies changed the economics of that business because they allowed these companies to scale up, to go geographically. That allowed them to get bigger. So technology has shifted some businesses that used to be restricted in terms of how big they could get to become much bigger. A related benefit that came out of the technology shift is what's called a networking benefit. What does that mean? Usually as companies get bigger, it becomes more challenging to go for more growth because your easiest customers adopt your products and services first. If you have networking benefits, as you get bigger, it gets easier to get bigger. Again, I'm going to use the ride-sharing companies to illustrate this process. If you're a ride-sharing company, as you get bigger, you find that it's easier to attract drivers to drive for you and customers to take your app because you are now the bigger company. In other words, as you get bigger, it gets easier to get bigger. You create winner-take-all businesses. Take winner-take-all businesses, you can grow to be a much bigger business. And finally, there is the regulatory constraint that can restrict how big you can get as a business. Antitrust laws can come to work against you if you become too big a business. The greater the threat of that cut down, the smaller you have to be as a business. So all those factors will determine how big you can become as a company. So you looked at the height, you've looked at the length. Let's look at the shape. What is that determines how quickly a company can climb through the life cycle? The first is capital intensity. Capital intensive businesses, toll roads, steel companies, they take longer to build. The typical 20th century company, we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes, took decades to build because it's a manufacturing company. In contrast, a software company requires much less capital to grow. The less capital intensive a business, the quicker you can scale up the business. Access to capital matters as well. If you're in a market where access to capital is free and easy, it becomes easier to grow. Companies in markets where there's free access to capital should be able to grow faster than companies in countries without that access. In the last decade, between 2010 and 20, one of the phenomena that occurred globally was risk capital became easier and more accessible across the globe. That allowed companies to scale up quicker. The third is customer inertia. You're trying to attract customers from established companies. The more difficult it is to get customers to switch away, the slower you will grow. So in businesses where there's a lot of inertia, where customers tend to go with what they've done historically, it's more difficult to grow. That's why products and services that have been around a long time, where customers are kind of locked in by brand name and by their history of buying the same product, it becomes more difficult to grow quickly. And finally, again, regulatory restrictions play a role. Now, if you're in a business where you have to get regulatory approval for the next step, pharmaceuticals, much more difficult to grow quickly than if you're a software company. So all those factors determine shape. Finally, let's talk about how long you stay at the top. That really is a debate about what are your barriers to entry once you've got there. What are the moats you've built up? And Morningstar actually did a really good job of breaking competitive advantages down on two dimensions. One is how big is the competitive advantage? How difficult is it? And the second is how strong is it based on what kind of competitive advantages? This is not meant to be an all-inclusive table, but basically you can have wide, narrow, or no moat, and 5 different competitive advantages. One is brand name, where your name is recognized, people are willing to pay a higher price for your products. Second is switching costs, where once people have used your product, there's a cost to switching out or the cost to switching in. Third is the network effect we talked about. The fourth is a cost advantage you have. It costs you less to make a product than your competitors. And the fourth is efficiency of scale. As you get bigger, it actually costs you less to make the same unit. This table is not, the examples in this table might be dated, but when you look at your company, you're looking at what are its competitive advantages? How wide is that moat? Is it a wide moat, a narrow moat, a no moat? What kind of moat is it? Because the stronger and more sustainable a competitive advantage is, the longer you can stay at the top. In fact, herein lies the irony. The kinds of businesses where it's easy to scale up and you can get big really fast, tend to be the kinds of business where it's difficult to stay at the top for very long, because the same forces that allowed you to scale up mean you can't stay at the top for very long. And when you go into decline, you decline much more quickly as well. In fact, that brings me to a picture of a life cycle where all these factors are built in. As you look at the life cycle, early in the life cycle, the failure rate is determined by the ease of entry into the market, how easy is to access capital, how quickly you grow will depend on capital intensity, the kind of business, customer inertia. How long you stay at the top will be determined by the kind of competitive advantages you have. And how quickly you scale down will be almost a mirror image of how quickly you scaled up. Businesses where it takes decades to build up, which is a disadvantage when you're building up, often have an advantage in decline because it'll take decades for them to scale down. So those are life cycle determinants, and I'm going to use that to kind of introduce something that's going to run through the rest of the sessions. The classic 20th century company took a long time to grow. In fact, if you think about life cycle contrasts, you can see that life cycles can take lots of different forms. You can take a long time to grow and a long time to decline, a long time to grow and decline quickly. So all these variants fall in. In fact, you could even argue that there are some companies that choose to grow a long time by staying small. So as you look across companies, corporate life cycles can take lots of different forms. But I'm going to make a generalization that I think does explain a great deal of the shift that we've seen between the last century and this one. The classic non-tech company, the classic 20th century company, Ford, GE, took decades to build up, gradual build up, was able to stay at the top for a lot longer because they built up strong competitive advantages, and it's taken them decades to scale down. In fact, you look at GE, founded in 1892. Now, last rites probably 120 years later. Long and glorious life, even though the end might have been depressing. Ford took decades to build up, still around as a company. The classic 20th century company lasted decades, perhaps, successful companies lasted 80, 90, 100 years. And much of what we teach in business and valuation is built for the 20th century company. The classic 21st century company, Yahoo. It's not a 21st century company technically because it was founded in 1992. It took them 8 years to go from nothing to $100 billion. What took Ford decades took, Yahoo 8 years. Lasted at the top maybe 3-4 years until Google came along, then went into decline. That was quick. And by the time you got to 2012, Yahoo was done as a business by 2015. Last rites were 23 years from start to end. The classic 21st century company has a compressed life cycle. In fact, the way I described this when I wrote about it the first time is I said tech companies age in dog years. The legend of dogs aging 7 times faster than human beings. A 20-year tech company is like a 100-year manufacturing company. And I think it has significant consequences for how we think about running these companies. And in my area, valuation, I think it needs a rethinking of how we think about value. Maybe specific, and I'll come back to it in more detail in a future session. You value a company, you tend to project out cash flows for a period, 5 years, 10 years. And at the end of the 10th year, you assume your cash flows continue in perpetuity. We know businesses don't last forever. But the reason we were able to get away with it is if your life for a company is 70, 80, 90 years, using a perpetuity gives you a value very close to what you'd have got using a 70-year life. It's a practice we developed in the 20th century, and we continue to use it today on the 21st century company, which has a life cycle of 20, 25 years. Maybe the way we think about what the value of a company should be at the end of year 5 or 10 has to be different. We'll come back and talk about the specifics, but you can already see that it sets the stage for rethinking how we think about business and value and investing as companies change around us. So in summary, when you look at a company, say, where does it fall in the life cycle? You could look at its corporate age, not a bad measure. But be careful. If it's a technology company, a 25-year-old company is a mature company, perhaps a declining company. You could look at the sector it's in, but that shortcut I don't think works anymore. Technology companies used to be more growth companies, but it's no longer the case. Technology is now 25 to 30% of the market. They're very much in the middle of the pack. But you can also look at its operating metrics, which I think is the best way to think about where your company falls in the life cycle. There's one final loose end I want to tie up before I end this session. There are family group companies in Latin America and Asia especially, which have been around centuries, 100 years, 150 years. You're saying, how do they keep extending the life cycle? The secret, I think, is in creating holding companies. A holding company is really not a publicly traded company in a single business. It's a portfolio of companies. So if we take as an example the Tata Group in India, the Tata Group is 113 companies spread across the life cycle. And in the holding company basically is the company that holds all of these different companies. So your end game, if it's as a family group or as a publicly traded company, is to create a company that lasts for an extended period. You keep adding new businesses, especially at the high growth end. Your portfolio of companies will keep going. Not necessarily value creating, but if survival and creating a company that lasts a long time is the end game, the holding company gives you one way to do it. One final point, and we'll end the session, which is and especially in the last 2 decades, we've had the disruptor effect. What does disruption do? It takes established businesses where companies had long life cycles and thought they could just coast and puts them at risk. It does have implications in business and investing because so much of what we do is built on the premise that once you've established yourself as a company, it's difficult for outsiders to break in. In fact, much of corporate finance and valuation is built around the presumption of what's called mean reversion, that things revert back to the way they used to be. If you have a bad year as a company, you revert back to what you had before the bad year. If you have, newcomers don't make it. But mean reversion can break down. And even companies with strong competitive advantages, as we've discovered in the last 20 years, can find a disruptor undercut those advantages. It does take this classic corporate life cycle and create uncertainty around it. And that uncertainty has to be factored in when you think about valuing and investing in these businesses or running these businesses. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found this session useful.